Just sense into the space around you, wherever you happen to be. Just feel being in the presence of your surroundings and being supported by them. So this would include breathing the air, and the sensation of being nourished by the air, entering your body, supporting your body, and being released back into the environment that you're in. And just really sense into that, sense how the body is moving with that. How the body already knows how to do that. We can be aware of the inhalation and exhalation, but after that, it's pretty much up to the body to take it from there. And we just trust the body to do that. We trust that the body knows how to do that, to support this life form. You can also notice the sensation of the air in the room on your skin. If there's any movement of air, it's a little bit warm on the skin, a little bit cool. And as we're noticing just these physical sensations, we can avoid the temptation to have an opinion about it, whether it should be different somehow, whether I should be breathing differently, or am I doing it right? We just allow it to be as it is. And just relax into that, trust the body. You can also notice if there's anything in the room that we hear other than the sound of the voice. And we can allow that to be as it is also. Just so we're just can be receptive to whatever's happening in the environment. The body's really good at that. The body's really good at receiving information. So we can notice if there's any sound in the room. You can notice the movement of the body with the breath. We can sense into the environment in the room, just our place in the room as an alive body, mind, organism in a space that we can perceive. And we can sense if we're holding anything back from being in that space fully. If we can just allow any sense of boundary between ourselves and the space around us to just soften. So that the skin, you could say conceptually, doesn't feel like a boundary. Because what the body's sensing is actually beyond the skin from our normal 5 senses. So it's actually sensing beyond this body-mind, informing this body-mind. So we can receive that information again without judging it in any way, without trying to manipulate the information in any way. Just allow it to be. Just allow that sensation of just simple receiving to really settle in more and more deeply into the body. You can also notice if there's any thought occurring. Again, it's the next piece of information showing up on the, let's say, screen of our awareness. Again, we don't have to try to manage it. We don't have to try to change it, improve it, get it right. If there's thought arising, we can just allow it to be there. It's no more intrusive than any other of these sensations unless we decide that it is. So we can also just notice that there's something that's aware of these different sensations, whether it's the movement of the body, the movement of the air in and out of our body, the sensing into the room, noticing the thoughts. And just this simple yet mysterious awareness that is present for all of that. The awareness isn't judging any of it. It is noticing it all. So we can just sort of step back from being focused on these different points of sensation to come back to that where it feels like we're more anchored in that awareness. Sensations are still happening. We're not denying anything. We may still notice that they're all still happening. Thoughts may still be happening. And yet there is this awareness that is noticing all of that. When we sense into this awareness, we can perhaps notice that there may be a sense of quiet there. Even though the mind may be talking, the awareness itself isn't in opposition to the talking, but is nevertheless present. So we can perhaps sense it into the quiet of that awareness, the silence of that awareness, in the midst of these other sensations. We might also sense into the non-judgmental quality of the awareness. Again, the mind may have the opinions about this or that. It should be different. The room should be cooler or warmer, or the chair more comfortable, or whatever. But the awareness itself actually doesn't do that. It's just present for whatever arises within that field. So from the perspective of the awareness, we can just relax. The arisings may still happen, But if we're not trying to change them or improve them or attain something or have some special experience, some spiritual experience, then we can perhaps notice that this awareness is already present. We didn't manufacture it, we didn't conjure it up, we didn't imagine it. We just noticed it, noticed its sort of ever-present quality. What we can do is allow ourselves just to rest in that often throughout the day. We can come back to it. The more we come back to just noticing this simple awareness, the more stable it will feel. It's of course stable already. It's just we tend to run away from it and then remember it and run away from it and remember it. It's already stable, but the coming back to it often creates a recognition in ourselves that it is ever present already. We can notice that it's at peace already. We can notice it's non-judgmental already. And we can notice it's silent already. All the things that we hope to attain through meditation and our spiritual seeking is there already. All that's required is that we slow down enough to recognize what is already present. And by slowing down, I mean ceasing to demand that our experience be different than it is. That simple exercise, you can do it much more quickly than we did here tonight. Just by sensing into it, it will become more and more easy to just notice, oh yeah, that awareness that I sensed into is still there. And again, now it's still there. It'll become easier and easier to notice it throughout the day, even when we're doing other things. And that will lead over a period of time to a sense of that awareness being abiding. That's the direction of the exploration. Okay. Everybody here? So the topic I thought we could talk about tonight is the unknown, right? It's bandied about in spiritual circles as, well, the unknown, right? It can be perceived as a fearful thing, some distant thing. So I thought it'd be worthy just to explore what that really is. So 2,500 years ago, Socrates famously said, I'm the wisest of all men because I know one thing, and that is, I know nothing. Dangerous statement, as it turned out. But what he's talking about is not our ordinary kind of knowing, obviously. I mean, I'm sure he knew how to put food in his own mouth and tie his sandals. And so we're talking about some other kind of knowing that is other than what we typically take to be knowledge. So I thought the way to approach this is maybe looking at a few things that we take for facts, things that we think we know for certain, just to loosen up our own certainty about what would normally be considered everyday, common, indisputable knowledge about things about ourselves and about the world. Okay, so let's pick a simple one. Let's take the Earth rotating around the sun. Everybody knows that to be true, right? So if you had, let's say a 2-year-old or 3-year-old, when everything that you say, the response from the 3-year-old is why, and you have to answer that. So if you were trying to explain to a 3-year-old or 4-year-old maybe why it is true that the sun goes around the Earth, I think you'd find pretty quickly that you'd run out of explanations that even you could believe yourself. Right? Unless you happen to be a astrophysicist that has done the proof for themselves. It's one of those things that we take on as something that's true. I mean, the scientists talk about it, nobody really disputes it. And so we take that to be true, even though we haven't done the math ourselves, but we trust that someone else has done that, a scientist has done that, and that's what we were taught, and it seems to be reasonable, so we take that as a fact. But in our case, like I say, unless you happen to be an astrophysicist, it's actually a belief. We don't know that for certain ourselves, but we take it as a truth, just based on common conventional knowledge. So that's the level of distinction that I'm talking about. I'm not saying that the Earth doesn't go around the sun. It appears that that's very likely that that's what happens. There was a time when most people didn't believe that either, but so I'm not saying that's not true. I'm just saying that for most of us, nearly all of us, it is a belief, not something that we actually know. Okay, so we'll take a little more subtle example. Let's just take the case of let's say a blue flower, right? We could say, well, everybody knows what I mean when I say a blue flower. But it's worth really looking at how that concept of a blue flower actually arises. I mean, for example, if the sun isn't shining, if there's no light at all, what color is the flower? We don't know, right? We can't see it. If there's no light, we can't see it. It's not reflecting any light. And so we can't really say that the flower is blue. What we can say is when the light is shining, it appears to my eyes what I call a color blue. Okay. So my eyes might be different than your eyes. What I'm seeing may be different than what you're seeing. We know that some people are colorblind and see quite differently than most of the rest of us see. In Russia, they actually have 2 different words for 2 different colors, both of which we group together and call them blue. So in Russian, when something that we would call blue appears, they would name it two totally different things. So that linguistic veil actually changes how one looks at something, right? And then there's also the question of how well, how reliably, how accurately our eye apparatus receives and transmits the information to the brain, and then what the brain does with that, depending on our conditioning about flowers and the color blue, and whether we're a botanist or whether we grew up on a farm enjoying flowers and blue flowers, etc. So all of these things go into how we actually perceive just a very simple thing that we refer to as a blue flower. So what we imagine that we see, we imagine that we all see the same sort of immutable, objective world around us, but that's actually not the case. We tend to see it from through our conditioning, right? Either biologic conditioning or psychological conditioning. So we're not actually seeing the same thing, even though we all believe that we do. Okay, so we can also talk about, this body mind. Surely, we can find some objectivity here, right? We can look at our body, we can see it, we can think. Therefore, we have this thinking apparatus happening. And that's typically how we define ourselves as a separate person in this world. And that's what we've been taught, that this side of our skin is separate from that side. This side is me, that side is everything else. So what the body's really good at, as we said at the start, is receiving information. It's a sensing organism. It has these five senses. I mean, there are other senses that we don't have, but we have these five senses that by which we perceive our surroundings. So the body's really good at that. It's good at transmitting that information to our thinking organism. And it's good at moving around in the world. It helps us spatially navigate the world, right? What it doesn't have is a sense of self in itself. In itself, without the mind, without the mental capacity, the body itself doesn't have a sense of separate self. Okay. So the mind does, right? The mind has the concept that what I am is separate. It consists of this body and this mind, and together they make up me. Together, of course, with all of my history and stories and beliefs and opinions and hopes and dreams and regrets and all of that. That creates a package that is me. But when we really start to look more carefully at what the mind is capable of doing, it's capable of processing information that it receives from the body, deciding what to do with that. It's capable of remembering things that happened in the past. It's capable of conceptualizing about things that aren't directly in front of us at the moment. And it's capable, apparently, of deciding to act or speak or move in some way. But when we say it's capable of receiving information from the body, I mean, it receives an enormous amount of information just every moment of our existence, almost all of which is ignored consciously. It's like when we are looking out of the backyard off the porch, let's say. I mean, all that entire visual field is entering our body, but what we may consciously notice might only be the squirrel. Right? So all that other information is received and, from a conscious perspective, just discarded, just ignored. So it never even rises to the level of conscious awareness of the rest of that field, unless we step back and sort of widen our perspective. Actually, a similar thing is true for our memory. I mean, we believe that we have more or less a continuous history that we can recite to other people and recall. But when we go back and really try to fill in the gaps, what we find, especially as a few more years go by, is there's specific memories of events, and there's a lot of undefined gaps in between. The gaps may just have been an ordinary day. I think probably all of us, if we said, well, I'm going to go back and try to remember, like really remember, not just conceptually, but, recreate the event as a video in this moment, that level of reality. I'm going to go back and look at when I brushed my teeth 5 years ago, every day for a year. I would doubt that any of us could replay any of those 365 events, or more if you brush your teeth twice a day. So all of those events happened, we were present for them, but they're not subject to our memory just because they weren't, in the opinion of this organism, not that memorable, right? If something, really unusual, positive or negative happened while we were brushing our teeth, maybe we fell and broke a tooth or something, then we would remember that particular incident. Otherwise, it's just not remembered. So even though we rely a lot on memory to define who we are, all the stories, all the events and wins and losses and things that we did over the years or didn't do or had regrets about, all of those things form certain moments within a long extended period of time, right? So when we think of this, we think of ourselves as this continuously alive, present person, and yet there are these major gaps in our memory where we really don't have any conscious recall of what happened during that period of time. But we sort of, through our conceptualization about who we are, we sort of skim over that detail and just note the high points, well, high and low points, to create this history of ourselves. And then we add in, our hopes and fears about the future and some current day facts, and sort of put that package together of this is who I am. But that, whatever it is that is dependent on that memory, isn't reliable in that sense. And then, of course, we have the ability of the brain to conceptualize about everything. Right? We conceptualize about who we are. We conceptualize about who the other person is, what kind of world we live in, who should and shouldn't do things. Conceptualization about heavens and angels and God herself, and concepts about everything. But the one thing that concepts all have in common is that none of them are true. None of them are true because any concept is less than the reality that it's referring to. It's a concept. It's a concept. It's a summary. It's a, you know, an attempt by our thinking mind to put it, some experience or some, let's just say experience, some experience into words, into a concept that is run through our head in a very linear fashion, or we can say it out loud. You know, and then we can believe that concept is actually true. Actually, most people believe that their concepts about life are actually more true than their experience of life lived directly. Okay, so we have, you know, just to look at where we've gotten to here, we have a body that is, its nature, it has a lot of abilities, right? It can inform us, it can sense into our surroundings, it can move about in the world in a spatial kind of way. But it doesn't, in itself, it doesn't have this sense of self, sense of separate self. The mind does, but it does through limited means of conceptualizations and memories and ideas that it has about itself. Okay, so when we're looking for something, let's say eternal, something that's not subject to the impermanence of, you know, the comings and goings of forms in the world, the body doesn't have the means to access that. It has the means to sense forms, but it doesn't have the means to sense into the formless. I'm talking about our normal, the way we normally look at the body, and its five senses, etc. From that perspective, the mind also, you know, because its capacity is limited to conceptualizing and memories and imagining the future, it also doesn't have the capacity to access the eternal, simply because it's limited by its concepts about anything, right? So we have the body and the mind, neither of which is the correct apparatus, it's the correct instrument that is sufficient to access something that's can only be accessed beyond the conceptual mind. So where does that leave us? Right? If we're not able to use the instrument that we're given, this body and this mind, to access that which we intuitively believe, feel exists, that there's this longing to fully experience, where does that leave us? If we can't use our mind to get there, so I would suggest that the only doorway that's really available to us is recognition of this innate awareness that we pointed to at the outset tonight. So that awareness is fundamentally different than any conceptualization. That awareness is already formless. That awareness is already at peace. So normally when we first, maybe our first glimpse of this awareness, or first suspicion that that might have real value, um, or just that it even exists as something beyond the capability of this body mind in the conventional sense. We're fascinated by that, but we also tend to go back to the mind to judge whether that experience of the awareness is real or not. So in other words, we may experience the awareness, but we're still going back into mental concepts, mental judgments, to convince ourselves for or against that direct experience is real or valid, or the real experience, all of which the mind is incapable of doing. What the mind is capable of doing, and certainly could and should be used for, is, if we're interested in looking more deeply into this, what I'm calling eternal tonight, what the mind is useful for is questioning the validity of its own concepts. Things that we took to be real, that we don't actually know for sure. We don't actually know that who we are was born, for example. The body clearly was, but were we? Was there something that existed prior to birth? I'm not talking about just in the womb or not. I'm talking about prior to our grandparents. Do we know for sure that what we essentially are didn't exist? And we assume that it didn't, but do we know that for sure? So this is, again, what I meant up front about being able to distinguish between what we believe and what we know. It's good to really explore that sort of courageously, just to unseat things that we're certain of. That's actually what is meant by the term spiritual ignorance. So it doesn't have anything to do with one's level of intelligence. It has to do with believing things that we don't actually know are true. And the journey that the mind is helpful to participate in is to really look at those deeply, even analytically, to see whether they're true or not. See whether they're true or not from the deepest understanding that we can bring to bear. That's what the mind can be helpful for. Knowing all the while, or at least at some point encountering the fact that the mind can't take us beyond a certain frontier. It can take us like right up to the precipice where it realizes for itself, the mind realizing for itself that it is not capable of going beyond conceptual thought. So from the mind's perspective, we talk about everything beyond that as the unknown, right? From the mind's perspective, it is unknown. It's not only the unknown, it's unknowable. It's unknowable from the sense of conventional mental knowledge, which we've all grown to trust. We all tend to give those that mental capacity the final judgment about whether something's real or true. So when we begin talking about something beyond the conceptual mind, beyond our mental abilities to figure out or to understand, and we apply the term unknowable to it, it can sound a little scary, like, well, how would I know if it's even true or not, or real or not, or whether it's just my imagination, or, you know, the mind, this is all the mind talking, right? These are all the fear-based objections to wandering out beyond the limits of the conceptual mind. But when we are doing that, you can feel that that's just a conceptual approach to something that the mind doesn't understand, right? So I'll label it the unknown, and then I'll question whether I really want to go there or not. But at the same time, you know, concurrent with all of that doubt and projection and fear-based thinking, all the while, the awareness is perfectly functional, right? It's watching the whole show. It's like watching a drama, right? Will she or won't she go beyond the mind? In the meantime, the awareness is already, you know, beyond the conceptual mind. It's not subject to form. It's not subject to the impermanence of form. It's not in the same arena as form. By form, I'm including conceptual thought. You know, it's the awareness just isn't subject to that. It is what notices all of that. The awareness, you could say the field of awareness is that within which all of that mental conceptual activity happens. So if we allow ourselves to settle in more and more into this awareness, does that mean that we know something that people who haven't done that don't know? In other words, is there a data bank, an informational bank that you learn when you, let's say, wake up to your true nature? I mean, that's often the assumption, right? I'll be all-knowing, you know, I'll have immense wisdom and know lots of things. No, you still don't know anything. But you're comfortable with that. That's the difference. It doesn't, you know, the idea of not knowing and living from that space can be scary from the mind's point of view. From the point of view of awareness, it is fine. It's fine. So we get comfortable with that after a while, but it can be a surprise at first how different one's perception of oneself in the world looks when we realize what we truly are. There's a really curious, sort of surprising quote by Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, which is a Gnostic gospel that didn't make the cut into the compiled Bible. But it's the entire gospel is just sayings of Jesus. There's no storyline. But one of the sayings that's really surprising is that it starts off, I'll have to paraphrase here, but it starts off basically, seek until you find what you are seeking. Okay, that's reasonable. The second sentence is what's surprising. It says, when you find what you are seeking, you will be disturbed. And then it goes on, you will marvel and you will reign over all things. Okay, but the first um, reaction can be um, almost disturbance in a sense, because it shakes up our world so dramatically that things that we um, believed were true, ways that we had of acting, um, conventions that we had about speaking, ideas about who we were, all of those, the roots of all of those have been cut. And so we might find ourselves, particularly after the honeymoon period, after awakening, we may find ourselves not really knowing what to say to other people, not knowing what to do, um, not being motivated by the things that used to motivate us. So it can be quite surprising. Um, but that kind of statement would appear um, in one of the Gospels is still surprising. True, but surprising. Okay. So as we sense into this awareness, like I said, it's not like we know a whole range of things. It's that the feeling is really that we know what we need to know when we need to know it. Not before, and afterwards it's just a stale recollection. It's not helpful. But in a moment of a situation, there tends to be more of a sense of knowing what I need to do, what I need to say, how I need to act in that moment. Not based on an agenda, not based even on a morality, not based on a belief system, just there's a knowing that that's the appropriate thing to do in that situation. You know, it takes some time for that level of response, sort of clarity of response to penetrate this body-mind. Body-mind is so conditioned that even with the recognition of awareness as our fundamental identity, we can have that awareness, and the body-mind is still slow to come around. That's my sense of it. It will eventually, but it may take some time. In Zen, they talk about give it 10 to 15 years before you try to talk about it too much. Let it really have time to penetrate all of the conditioning of this body-mind. So when I talk about conditioning of the body-mind, I'm not saying that all conditioning is dysfunctional. I mean, clearly a lot of conditioning, things that we've sort of taught our body or our mind over this lifetime are very functional. I mean, just the ability to talk or write or drive a car or sing or dance or do anything, garden, build something. All of those things are, wonderful types of conditioning where we've trained this body and mind to perform in certain ways. So by conditioning that has to be penetrated, I'm not talking about any of that. I'm just talking about the ways that we hold ourselves in sort of self-identification, limitations of what we believe that we are. And this awareness, as it grows in, let's say, embodiment within this form, penetrates that so that this form becomes over time more and more transparent to that life energy, you could say. This life energy has a movement to it. It's not empty, like void of everything. It's empty as in absent of our personal self, absent of our agenda, ambitions, beliefs, opinions, etc. It has its, well, the agenda of life, right? doesn't care so much about our own personal agenda at that point. What we do have the freedom to do is to come into an alignment with life, how life is moving at any particular moment. And that movement of life itself is fresh, it's alive, it's there's wisdom to it, and we can sense that in these forms. You know, we can never know that in the sense of mental knowing. We can never know that, what that awareness is, that eternal. We don't know that in any kind of mental, conceptual way, but we can be that. We can be a conduit for that in a sense. We can allow that aliveness, that beingness to flow through these body minds with as little impedance as possible. And we never know from moment to moment what that will look like in any particular situation until that moment arrives. So we're still in a state of not knowing, but like I say, we become more and more comfortable with that. It's actually immensely freeing, alive, makes life a lot more enjoyable, actually. You know, we believe that we know and can manage and sort of control our future. And deep down, we know that's not actually really true, even though we spend a great deal of energy trying to manipulate that. So it's much, much more enjoyable just to allow this life energy to flow through us, as us, in alignment with life itself. So in a sense, I mean, we give up our own, you could say personal will, personal agenda, what I want, we give that up, yes. But what we gain is the sense of life in its entirety. Simply because we're no longer separate from it. What holds us separate from that sense of life is this belief in a separate self, in this belief of the primacy of our thinking mind, in the belief that what I am is limited to this body. Those are the concepts that are worth investigating. Those are the concepts that hold in place a sense of separation. Without that, we don't have to try to transcend our sense of separation. We can just see that the whole sense of separation is illusory. It's just a mistaken belief. That's actually what we give up. We give up an innocent misinterpretation of what we are. And you don't have to worry about giving up too much. What's real doesn't go away. You know, it's only what is illusory, what's not actually who we are, that that can be given up anyway. We don't even have to try to give it up. We just see that it's not ultimately true. It's the seeing that it's not ultimately true that does all the work. Once we see something as illusory, we don't have to try to let it go. It's the nature of illusions to drop away once we've seen it as not true. And what's left is this expansiveness. We can call it awareness, we can call it life, we can call it the divine, we can call it the eternal, we can spacious emptiness, we can use whatever words we want, but it's still the unknown. It's still, we can be it, we can live from it, we can be in awe of it, we can enjoy it. but we can never know it from the conventional sense of mental knowledge. That's actually the beauty of it. It's the freedom of it, that we're no longer operating from sort of stale past beliefs that we're trying to apply to the current situation. You know, when we're operating from the unknown, it's always fresh, simply because we don't know what is or what may occur in the next moment. We don't now, but this is just the recognition of what's already true. We don't know now, you know, we won't know then. The only difference is we know and expect that we don't know. Simple, actually.